The Knock, Chapter 1. It's out there. Chuck Thomas didn't live in the middle of nowhere, but he could see it from his front porch. A man of simple habits and solitary tendencies, he'd made his home deep in the coastal redwoods. It was a quiet life, the kind that suited someone who wasn't afraid of silence or of being alone with his thoughts. But lately, the silence had been broken. It started with the knock. Chuck had heard plenty of sounds in the woods over the years. Coyotes yipping at the moon, owls hooting in the distance, and the occasional bear snorting as it rummaged too close to his property. But this was different. The first time he heard it, he'd been chopping firewood. A sharp, deliberate knock came from the trees. Not a branch falling or the wind playing tricks. It was rhythmic, purposeful. Then, moments later, another knock answered. The knocks weren't random, and they weren't stationary. They moved. Sometimes closer, sometimes farther away. At first he chalked it up to echoes or even deer antlers hitting trees. But as the days went on, the pattern became unmistakable. It wasn't noise, it was communication. Chuck had read enough stories to know where his mind was going. Bigfoot, skinwalkers, or maybe something even weirder. He didn't talk about it, didn't tell the bartender in town or the old-timers who sat on the store porch trading stories. Who would believe him? Hell, he didn't believe it. Not fully. But he couldn't deny that something was out there, and it was getting bolder. That evening, Chuck decided to clear his head. He stepped outside, the cold biting through his flannel as he grabbed an armful of firewood from the stack. Lighting a cigarette, he leaned against the doorframe, letting the smoke curl up into the starlit sky. It was quiet, save for the distant rustle of the trees. Then, out of nowhere, a sound cut through the stillness. A dog barking. Chuck froze. There weren't any dogs out here, at least not that he knew of. His nearest neighbor lived a good mile away, and they sure as hell didn't have a dog. The barking came from deep in the woods, sharp and insistent, echoing through the redwoods like a warning. Before Chuck could process it, the sensor light above his door clicked on, flooding the yard in harsh white light. He blinked, caught in its glow like a deer in headlights. Then he heard it. A crashing sound, far off at first but growing louder. Something big was tearing through the forest. Branches snapped, undergrowth thrashed, and the barking ceased as quickly as it had started. The thing was coming straight for him. Chuck's cigarette fell from his lips as his hands scrambled for the door handle. His pulse thundered in his ears as the noise barreled closer, a freight train of raw power crashing through the trees. He flipped the switch inside, killing the lights. Darkness swallowed the clearing, and Chuck pressed himself against the wall, holding his breath. It burst into the clearing then, the crashing suddenly silenced as it hit open ground. Now there were only footsteps, heavy, quick, deliberate. It ran right past him, so close he could feel the air shift. His heart pounded as he listened, ears straining in the darkness. The footsteps crossed the driveway, past the side of the house, and plunged back into the woods, the crashing fading into the distance until there was nothing but silence once more. Chuck didn't move for what felt like an eternity. Then, slowly, he turned and stepped back inside, locking the door behind him. His hands shook as he lit another cigarette, the glow of the flame illuminating his pale face. This wasn't the first time something strange had happened, and Chuck knew, deep in his gut, that it wouldn't be the last. The knocks had been the beginning, and now it was playing with him, testing him. He didn't know what it wanted or why it was toying with him, but one thing was clear, he wasn't imagining this. Chuck stared out the window, the woods stretching endlessly into the night. His fear warred with curiosity, a dangerous mix that kept him rooted here when any sane man would have packed up and left. He took a long drag, exhaling slowly as the redwoods loomed like silent sentinels. "I've got a feeling," he muttered to no one, his voice barely above a whisper, "that this story's not over yet." He was right. The Knock, Chapter 2, helped me. Chuck Thomas wasn't crazy. He was sure of that. Or at least as sure as a man could be after spending weeks in a cold, creaking house in the middle of nowhere, listening to the woods taunt him. If anything, the madness wasn't inside his head. It was out there, somewhere in the shadows between the redwoods, playing its own little game of psychological dodgeball with him. Take last week, for instance. Snow had blanketed the ground, a rare treat in this part of the country, and Chuck had been trudging outside every morning to shovel it off the driveway. He'd noticed that, without fail, every time he stepped outside, a fat clump of snow would fall from the tree branches onto his nearest neighbor's roof. Every single time. It was almost comical, like a slapstick routine orchestrated by the universe. "Guess I'm Mother Nature's favorite chew toy," Chuck had muttered to himself, trying to laugh it off. But then there were the branches. Tiny, brittle twigs falling out of the trees like confetti, always hitting him square on the head. It was harmless, sure, but after the 5th or 6th time, it stopped feeling random. He started glancing up at the treetops, half expecting to see a squirrel flipping him the bird. And then there was this morning. Chuck had shuffled over to the side entrance, coffee mug in one hand, the other reaching for the door handle. He twisted it, pushed, and nothing. The door wouldn't budge. He frowned, shook it a little, and then yanked harder. Whatever was holding it gave way with a sudden snap, and the door swung open. That's when he saw it. Someone, or something, had tied a piece of string to the handle and anchored it to a bush nearby. It wasn't fancy, just a scrap of twine Chuck had lying around the yard, but the knot was suspiciously deliberate, too neat to be random, too intentional to be innocent. For a long moment, Chuck just stood there, staring at the string dangling limply from the handle. The wind rustled through the trees as if the forest was trying to hold back laughter. "All right, haha," he muttered, stepping outside to look around. "Very funny. Who's the jackass?" No answer. Just the distant bark of that damn dog again, somewhere out in the woods. The thing was, Chuck knew his neighbors, or rather, he knew the lack of them. His closest one lived a mile away, and she was about 80 years old with 2 bad hips and no patience for pranks. Whoever or whatever was messing with him wasn't local, and it sure as hell wasn't welcome. Chuck lit a cigarette and stood in the yard, squinting into the woods where the dog's barking echoed. It was the same spot as before, off to the northwest, somewhere deep in the trees. "Hey!" Chuck hollered, waving his free hand. "You lost or something? Or are you just trying to piss me off?" The barking stopped. For a moment everything was silent. Then faintly a new sound emerged. "Help," a voice croaked. Chuck froze. "Help me," it said again, a little louder this time. It didn't sound right. The words were spaced out like someone struggling to remember how language worked. And the tone was wrong. It reminded him of a parrot mimicking human speech, close enough to recognize but off enough to be unsettling. "Help," it said one more time, dragging out the word like it was testing it. Chuck felt the cigarette slip from his fingers, hissing as it hit the snow. His gut twisted into a knot, his mind racing. Nobody calls for help like that. Nobody says the same words the same way over and over, like a goddamn broken record. And yet, it sounded intentional. Chuck backed up, his boots crunching in the snow, and slipped inside the house. He locked the door, leaned against it, and tried to steady his breathing. He wasn't scared, he told himself. Not really, just cautious. He stood there for a few minutes, listening. The woods were silent now, as if holding their breath. Chuck cracked the door open just enough to stick his head out, ears straining for any sound. Nothing. No dog. No voice. Just the creak of branches swaying in the breeze. He shut the door again, sliding the deadbolt into place, and leaned back against it. That's when the thought hit him, cold and sharp as the winter air outside. What if it wasn't calling for help? What if it was mimicking someone else calling for help? What if that voice was all that was left of whoever it had hunted before? Chuck shivered, the weight of the realization settling deep in his bones. He wasn't crazy. He was in trouble. For the first time since moving out here, Chuck felt an overwhelming urge to leave. To pack up, get in his truck, and put as much distance between himself and these woods as possible. He exhaled slowly, staring at the door. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't done with him yet. But he was done with it. At least, that's what he told himself. The knock. Part 3. Flat as a pancake. Chuck Thomas had enough of the creeping dread, the weird sounds, and the feeling that the universe itself was poking him with a stick just to see if he'd snap. Standing in his kitchen, he muttered, "That's it. I'm out." He grabbed his duffel bag and started packing. Clothes, flashlight, ammo, and a half-eaten bag of Doritos he'd been saving. He was ready to bolt. The idea of civilization, cheap beer, and a good lock on the door called to him like a siren song. Then, just as he zipped the bag, he heard it. Shh! The sound was unmistakable, like 1,000 tiny demons whispering, "Screw you," into his ear. He knew before even looking. The truck tire. No, 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 Chuck hissed, rushing outside. Sure enough, the front passenger side tire sagged against the dirt, flat as a pancake. "What the f***?" he screamed, kicking the flat for good measure. The forest, smug and silent, offered no reply. He yanked open the passenger door, grabbed his shotgun, and fired a shot into the sky. "Come on then! Now what?" As if on cue, the knocking started again. But this time was different. It wasn't a quick tap-tap or a deliberate thud-thud. No, this was relentless. A steady, pulsing rhythm. Knock, 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 knock. It was coming from about 30 yards into the trees, too close for comfort. Chuck froze. This wasn't random. This wasn't just some creature making noise. This was a message. The knocking wasn't just a sound. It was a taunt. It was saying, "I'm here, asshole. I'm so close. You could come find me if you weren't such a scared little coward." Chuck tightened his grip on the shotgun, his knuckles going white. He wanted to charge into the trees, guns blazing, but his legs refused to move. Then, the knocking changed. It wasn't just a steady rhythm anymore. It was beatboxing. Chuck blinked, his brain stuttering like an old modem trying to connect. The creature was making beats, layering in guttural grunts, pops, and some weird throat noises that sounded like a bass drop gone wrong. And here's the messed up part. It slapped. Chuck, despite the shotgun in his hand and the fear in his gut, found himself thinking, "Damn, this is kind of a banger." "Focus, Chuck," he shouted, shaking himself. He felt the truck keys in his pocket and made a decision. Screw the flat tire. Screw the beats. Screw whatever the hell this thing was. He was getting the hell out of here. Chuck jumped in the truck, fired up the engine, and slammed it into drive. The flat tire screamed in protest, but he didn't care. Dirt sprayed as he tore down the narrow, winding road, the forest rushing past in a blur. He'd barely made it a quarter mile when he heard the sound. It started faintly like a distant freight train, but quickly grew louder. A rhythmic thud, 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 pounding the earth. Chuck glanced in the rearview mirror and his stomach dropped. Something was running after him. It was massive, at least 8 feet tall, with long, majestic hair flowing behind it like some kind of cursed Fabio. Its muscular frame glistened in the moonlight, but its face was the real kicker. Its eyes burned with rage, but its mouth twisted into a maniacal grin, teeth bared in a way that screamed, "I'm enjoying this way too much." The thing wasn't just running, it was sprinting. Chuck slammed the gas pedal to the floor, the truck bouncing and skidding as he pushed it to its limits. "This is not happening," he muttered, gripping the wheel. "This is not happening." The beast was relentless, its legs pumping like pistons as it tore through the forest. It wasn't even following the road. It was taking a straight line, cutting across switchbacks and keeping pace with terrifying ease. And then, with a sickening thump, the truck lurched to one side. Chuck's eyes darted to the rearview mirror. The thing wasn't in the woods anymore. It was in the bed of his truck. "Jesus f***ing Christ!" Chuck shouted, his heart slamming against his ribs. He barely had time to process it before the truck's flat tire gave out completely. The vehicle fishtailed wildly, the wheel jerking out of Chuck's hands. "No, no, no!" The truck veered off the road, careening toward the edge of a cliff. Time seemed to slow as it broke through the underbrush and launched into the air. The world spun. The truck hit the ground sideways, rolling down the mountain in a cacophony of crunching metal and shattering glass. When it finally came to a stop, Chuck was unconscious, slumped against the steering wheel. Somewhere in the distance, the beatboxing continued. The rhythmic knocking faded into the night, leaving only the soft rustle of leaves and the quiet hum of the forest.